Hi, everyone, and welcome to our new podcast.
This week we talked to author and diplomat Nina Murray. Delnaz, I was wondering what you thought was interesting, the most interesting about our discussion with Nina. What did you particularly find enjoyable about her stories?
Yeah, for sure. One of the things I found most interesting was her response to our question of how the different countries compare when it comes to disinformation. And I really enjoyed her insights on that since she's been in many different countries and not everyone has had that experience. What about
Yeah.
you?
I also found it really interesting that when she talked about how news literacy and news bias really affected her profession as a U.S. diplomat and how that pertains to the developing of communication between countries. I found that really interesting. I also really liked her, stories about how she got into being a U.S. diplomat. I found that really
Me
interesting.
too.
Um, it's quite funny though that like she didn't kind of like proving to her husband that he could do it as well.
Yeah,
I found
yeah.
that very funny and interesting.
hmm This was a really insightful discussion, and I hope you guys enjoy it.
Hello, Dilnaz. Nice to meet you.
Hi, nice to meet you too.
Yeah, hi, Lauren.
Hello, it's good to see you again.
It's good to see you too. Yeah, how is it going?
Pretty good. Thank you for agreeing to talk with us. It's really exciting. Um,
Sure thing.
to start off, could you just tell us a bit about where you grew up and what that was like?
Sure thing. I grew up in Ukraine in Lviv, which is the Western Ukrainian capital. It's the biggest city closest to the Ukraine to the border with Poland, and it's kind of like I don't know if it's more Boston, the Boston of Ukraine, or the Portland of Ukraine. It's a little bit of both. It's very hip. It's historic, and so it always has a lot of tourists. And because it's very close to the border, it's also just by definition kind of multilingual because you get like news from Poland, and you always get like magazines and books from Poland and all this kind of stuff. And it's pretty big. It's about a million people. And so I left after I graduated from university, and back in my day, that meant a 5-year degree. So I finished that, and then I got married and went to Nebraska. Yeah, to a city of 200,000 in the middle of the Great Plains that is 150 years old or so, from a city that is 750 years old. So it's contrast. It was different.
I do have the next question. So we do know
Sure.
that you write. So what is it exactly that you write?
So I am a poet. As in terms of publishing, if you give me just 1 second, I knew I was gonna get that, but give me just a second. And like every poet, I have my books in my closet. So this is the first one, Minimize Considered. This is the full length, the big one, that I call the big one, Alcestis in the Underworld. This was just kind of fun to make. I self-published it. It's called 12 Poems About Dogs. And so it's got all my dog poems, and I collaborated with an artist. So it's got illustrations, it's got pictures in it. I write, I also blog a little bit. And occasionally I write, sometimes essays come out. I have attempted to short stories, and it just doesn't work very well. So I'm sticking to poetry. That's just kind of where I am. Yeah.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
And with your writing, do you find that writing helps? Has writing helped you um, through your job and your life in general?
It certainly did. So Minimize Consider, this little book, and I know I think you have a question about that as well. So I'm just going to cover the title in just a second. This I wrote I think all of the poems in here were written in Canada while we were in Canada for 2 years. I was serving in Toronto. I had a very demanding but also monotonous job, a very 8 to 5 kind of job that was not very imaginative. And so I just decided that I would take time every Saturday and write, and doesn't matter what comes out. So I did for, we were in Canada for 2 years. I didn't do it for 2 years. I did it maybe for one of the years. And I also read a lot of poetry. I just made it my job to do it, because otherwise I wasn't taking much in. And, then I went back to those poems and they were pretty good. And so I was like, all right, let's turn them in. I published a few while I was writing the whole collection. And then kind of naturally, there was a natural stopping point when we left Canada, and I stopped writing about, the urban setting and the high rises in the winter and the geese and all that stuff that I was writing about. And I figured I had a collection sort of ready to go. And then this one, the Alcestis in the Underworld, I don't know that you can see very well, but you can see there's a map on the cover. So after Toronto, I went to Moscow, and I was already prepared with this practice. So I wrote my way through Moscow. And this is the book that came out of that. Most of the poems in this book are written there. So then the next one, which doesn't exist yet, but the next collection is about, there's a little book that I don't have with me. There's a little chapbook that's about COVID-19 that has only about 10 poems in it. And then the most recent one is about moving here to England and a little bit about COVID-19. So yeah, definitely. So definitely everything is, I believe poets should have a completely unfettered imagination and should be able to write about anything and everything. There is no such thing as a proper subject for poetry or not a proper subject for poetry. Like, if it strikes you, write about it.
Since you already saw the questions, but if you would like to dive in a little on the title of Minimize Considered, that would be great.
Mm-hmm. So like I said, this was my very bureaucratic book. Rather, the setting was very bureaucratic. I was working in this very kind of by the rules job, and Minimize Considered is one of those bureaucratic terms that exists in the Foreign Service. It comes from the Foreign Affairs Manual. And I do believe I have it as yes, I do. So here it is. U.S. Department of State Foreign Affairs Manual, Volume 5, Handbook 1. It says, non-urgent, non-essential message traffic must be curtailed or reduced to a post that does not possess the means to process a normal telegraphic workload. All cable traffic must contain the phrase minimize considered as the last item of text prior to the signature. Basically, every message we send says minimize considered, which means we have thought about all the people who are not going to get it or can't get it or won't read it for whatever reason. And I thought it was such a paradoxical thing to put in your message. Like, here's a message that I'm sending, having considered that some of you are not going to read it. And then telling everybody that I have done that, which only probably matters to the people who are not going to read it, who can't read it. So anyway, it's one of those things that just had a grip on my imagination, and I thought it is kind of like writing poetry, where you write a message, you write a poem, and you're always thinking about how nobody's going to read it. So that I thought that, and it's a phrase that doesn't come up in everyday life. So I thought it would be pretty good for a book title.
Yeah, that is really interesting. I find that incredibly interesting. So you've talked a little bit about your job in Canada. Could you talk a little bit more about your profession in general? What is it you do, your job title, things like that?
Sure. So I'm on a sabbatical from the Department of State, which means I am not working for a couple of years as a U.S. diplomat. And when I do work, I work as a U.S. diplomat. The Department of State is a big organization, it's a big beast, and it has different groups of people working on it, doing different things. I'm part of one of those groups, which is called the Foreign Service. We are the people who actually go overseas and work in the U.S. embassies in different countries. I am a public diplomacy specialist, which means I do things that have to do with the public, which involves exchange programs, cultural exchanges, cultural events, media, all of media, everything that has to do with media, media engagement, media monitoring, media training, media tours, all kinds of different things. It's a big sort of sphere. It is so big that there are many places in the world where you don't do all of it. You just do a bit of it. Also English language programs and libraries. So you can tell there's a lot in that one job. And I have done this job. I've done everything. I did everything, the whole portfolio in Lithuania, because it's a fairly small mission, it's a fairly small country. And so we don't have necessarily every single program, and the ones that we do have, we don't have many people on them. So for example, every year we would send roughly maybe 30 people on exchange programs, as opposed to 300 from a different country. And then so I did that. Then in Toronto we all do a consular service for a couple of years, and that has to do with services to American citizens abroad and services to people who are coming to the United States, basically issuing visas, handling the visa traffic. And then after that, I went to Moscow to work as a public health analyst, which curiously, also, I was thinking about that, ended up being a lot of, there's a public and public health. So there were elements of public communication in that, and certainly elements of my main profession of managing exchanges that I found useful. I was able to create exchange programs specifically for public health professionals because I understood what they needed. And I also knew how to pitch a program, how to get a program funded, how to get it going. And we have an American Space Library, so we did things there that were themed around public health. We kind of had our little public health club going, and there for a while during the long dark winters. So that was pretty good. And then after that, I went back to Washington, D.C., and I was the director of, not the director, I was director of a particular program and a deputy director for all cultural programs that the State Department does. And that was my dream job. I don't know, I don't think it gets any better. It's the other side. You're not at post, you're not in the country making things happen, right? You're on the other side, you're in Washington. So you're helping to formulate programs, select artists, make sure everybody gets where they need to be going, make sure they get there on time, make sure they know how to do it. Those things. It's a lot of program development, a lot of idea development. So it's a very creative job. I would compare it to like a boutique PR firm a little bit, maybe, minus like we don't deal with the press. And then my last job was communications in agricultural trade, which for us means everything that has to do with agricultural trade, world hunger, world food programs, food aid, and genetically modified organisms. So there's a lot to communicate. That was more of a press job. Yeah, that was 10 years, 5 tours. Now I have to say, like, you don't have to do it that way. It's not typical. It just so worked out that I ended up with 5 tours in 10 years because I had no breaks between them. 11 years. You could do only 2 tours. You could potentially do only 2 tours in 10 years if you were learning hard languages, because some languages take 2 years to learn, and then you would be at post for 3 years for some. So it varies. There is no one size fits all. There's no typical in the State Department. Yeah, and so now part of my career is I stepped back, I took time off, and I write and translate full-time. Right now I'm translating full-time from Ukrainian into English.
So we'll take a step back here. How did you find yourself in this profession, in this position you've been?
Yes. So I was like, as I told you guys, I'm an immigrant, and but through marriage, I became a U.S. citizen. But I'm a naturalized U.S. citizen, obviously not born in the United States. My husband is a U.S. citizen, and he was part of the Fulbright program. After he graduated from law school, he and I went to Lithuania for the first time on his Fulbright. And so as an alumnus of the exchange program, he kept getting these messages about, oh, have you considered foreign service? Because foreign service is looking for people who have experience living overseas. It's one of the important things. I mean, you don't have to have it. The only thing that you have to join the foreign service is a high school degree. But experience living overseas is kind of like, well, if you're interested in being not in the United States, you might be interested in foreign service. So I kept sort of telling my husband, like, you're a lawyer, like, take the test. And what you do is you just take the test. If you pass the test, there's more tests. And if you pass the more tests, then there's the final test. And if you pass that, you're in. So it's not you do write an application, but it's an essay. It's a personal essay, kind of like a college, not dissimilar to a college application. But your grades don't matter. Right, your background professionally doesn't terribly matter because these jobs are unlike anything else. And so he didn't, and I thought, like, okay, fine, I'll sign up for the test just to prove to you that it's not difficult. Because he kept saying, like, oh, the only people who are in foreign service are the people who went to fancy schools. So I took the test and I passed it, and then I took the next test and I passed it, and then it got serious because for the final test you have to fly to Washington and do it in person, and it's it's a lot of pressure. So I passed that one, and then they said, well, okay, that's great, you passed the test, now we're going to do the security clearance and the medical clearance. And I thought I'd never get the security clearance because I'm not a naturalized citizen. I don't know why I thought that. There are plenty of like naturalized citizens in foreign service, but I didn't know anybody. Like, I didn't know anything. It wasn't something that, we didn't have career days at our university where people would come and say, like, oh, there's this whole like government thing that you could, it's not just the foreign service. There's a whole government thing that you could get into, and this is how it works. And here are the things that you need to know, like, hey, security clearance. So anyway, before we knew it, basically, we were having a garage sale and packing up our house and moving to Washington. And it was one of those classic road trips where we had a 13-year-old Saab and a 9-year-old dog, and it was packed to the roof. And we took 3 days to drive. And after we drove, that car died and we had to scrap it. And here we were. To say the rest is history. But yeah, and then my husband, he did join a couple years later, and his security clearance took forever, like much longer than mine. Yeah, that happens.
Thank you.
Yeah, you never know.
Right. The next question we would like to ask, I think I'm just going to combine the two, Lauren, the next two questions. But how many languages do you know, and where are all of the places that you have lived?
So I told you where I served. We're now living in England. I've lived in Ukraine, obviously. Those are places where I have lived for any extended period of time. So we did Lithuania twice. I am at this point, I have very rusty Lithuanian. I have I have a passive Spanish, which means I can understand most of what I read or hear, but I'm not super fluent. Which Spanish I just learned as a foreign language. I'd never been to a Spanish-speaking country. And then English, and then Russian and Ukrainian. And then also I can read Polish because of growing up so close to Poland. Yeah.
Thank you. So, how in your profession, does news bias and news misinformation affect your field of work? do you find it especially important working with different countries, different just a whole like unique field of work in general? Do you find misinformation to be important?
It critically, the entire Russian war and Russian invasion of Ukraine, the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, the current one, and the previous ones that started in 2014 were done under the cover of misinformation and disinformation. And so Russia is an example of, it's just the example that I'm most familiar with. It's not the only one. It's an example of a very tightly controlled media market domestically. And so there, what we do is we look at the structure of the media space, right? Who controls the voices? Whose messages do they repeat? And there are basically inside Russia no voices alternative to the state messaging. Let's put it this way. The independent news outlets mostly operate from outside of Russia. And then recently, we've also seen there are a lot of people on YouTube. There are now basically individual news channels on YouTube where people would do kind of what we're doing, invite people to talk. And that's where the independent, because you can watch YouTube more or less anywhere you want. I've never served in China. I couldn't tell you what that looks like. I just am familiar, but I do understand that structurally it's similar. And then it so happens that the information, so what we've been dealing with is right now, it's gotten better, but when the invasion started, Western media outlets would characterize the statements from Russia and from Ukraine the same. That is, they would say Ukrainian government states, Russian government states, like the state, or Ukrainian government claims, if it was like, pending evidence, Russian government claims. So the verbs they used were the same, and you couldn't tell from reading English news that one of these governments was consistently misrepresenting the truth. It's gotten a little bit better, but we still talk to, even I'm in it as just a citizen, as a Ukrainian and as a translator and interpreter, and I get called to interpret at events for various people. And so I part of these conversations just by virtue of being me, of being part of the language community. So I find that very interesting, because if you were to say that, if you were to characterize something as, I think we still have trouble characterizing something as misinformation or disinformation, because if you were to say X statement is disinformation, you still have to prove that it is, right? And it's kind of paradoxical, and so that helps information that is not genuinely true occupy the same ontological status, look the same and feel the same and come across the same in the information space, which is why I think the kind of work that you guys are doing is so important. And of course, before that, there was COVID-19, and public health is a classic. It's just that sphere where anytime you want to look for a case study, there's going to be one in public health.
Yes, definitely. Actually, this is kind of off topic, but it relates to that. I was looking at an Ebola study or about how disinformation affected that, and it was just crazy.
Oh my gosh, it was mind-boggling. I remember that. It was so terrible. COVID, similar. There's still a lot, depending on where you are. Like in the States, we don't have it around HIV. But in various places like Russia, one of the things we worked on was just misunderstanding and lots of myths about HIV. The kind of things that I suppose it's a successful case study for the United States, the kind of things that we don't run into anymore. Like we don't have this thing where like you wouldn't shake hands with somebody who's HIV positive because you were afraid to get it, right? We've gotten past that. It's kind of curious how things, not a thing anymore. And yet I couldn't, tracing how we got from A to B, from where we were to where we are. But I will say culture and art play an important role in getting us from sort of believing myths and biases and not believing them. I can tell that because I still follow a bunch of my colleagues on social media who are in Russia, who are doctors, and they tell everybody to go watch the old movie Philadelphia, and then also the Dallas Buyers Club. They're like, you have to watch this, like you absolutely have to watch this, which are both about dark days of that particular epidemic. I myself rewatched Contagion.
My favorite movie. I watched it about 6 times. Yeah.
Oh my gosh, it is such a case study. They were very, very good about so many things. There's so many things are so true, right? Like the CDC, you need one voice. You have to balance science and uncertainty, and we still don't know this, and we still don't know that, and we still don't know that. But we do need to isolate people now, and I need resources now, and how do we go about that? It's in that regard, it's really an excellent movie.
Yeah, it's such a great movie. This question, of course, you do see misinformation as an issue worldwide. You already answered that. But if you could go into more detail about how it compares in different countries, or how it contrasts, rather. If you could go a little bit more into that, although you touched on it a little bit.
It's an interesting question. I would say it has to do with the position from which I see it. So I see it from two different angles, right? One angle is just the structure of the media market. You can tell a lot by looking at that, by tracing ownership of media companies, and their sort of missions and interests, and how and the governance as well. So who do they respond to? Who are they accountable to? What's all that? And then you can see, because you generally see that independent media outlets do independent work, right? And then non-independent media outlets generally tend to side with a certain voice, with a certain set of ideas and views. And then the other level where you see that is people and just individual perceptions. We all carry biases and maybe things that are more like little superstitions, perhaps, or little prejudices that tend to, sometimes they're not so little, of course, that tend to shape the news that we consume. And so it's important for individuals, what an individual can do then is to make sure that they get news from different sources, or at least get news from a source that is by design is made to be balanced, like NPR, for example, or the BBC. Like they are mandated to present both sides of the story. I hope that's a helpful answer to the question.
Yes, definitely. Thank you so much.
So you talked a little bit about your translating. I was wondering, what are your recent or even long-term goals in the future coming up, or plans?
Oh, thank you. I have projects until next spring. So my goal, first and foremost, is to stand top of the project. I have a bunch of essays that I'm doing that the deadline is in 4 days, but it's fine because I only have one left. I have a play due 2 weeks from then that I'm translating. Then there's a novel and there's another play. And if I can do all of those things, and I'm collaborating with somebody on some poetry and some translated poetry, which is kind of in that state where we think it's going to be signed up for publication, but it hasn't yet, but it's a lot. And so we're translating it anyway, so that when it does get signed for publication, we don't have to do the whole thing. Anyway, there's always something. We say, you have your eye on a book, you have a book you're working on, and you have a book you're revising. And then you have a book in editing. So that's kind of the life cycle of what's happening. Yeah, so a book in a publishing queue, a book that's being translated, and something that I have my eye on for the future. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, it was so, so nice to meet you. Um, we're excited to see the books that come. We will definitely be keeping our eye out. We want to thank you for talking with us. It was a joy.
Yes, thank
Oh,
you so much. I'm definitely going to read all of your works. It was great meeting you.
thank you. You're very kind. Well, if you think of something later or you want to talk about a different topic, or something comes up, please feel free to reach out. And I'm here. I'll be happy to talk to you again. I think you guys are doing wonderful work, and it's very important. And I hope you succeed.
Thank you
Thank
so
you.
much. That means a lot. Thank you.
Yes, of course. All right.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you.
You're welcome. Bye bye.